So just for those who arrived late, there were two handouts. One is a repeat of the tutorial handout that you were given by email. The other is the handout for Gogh, which we might reach to at the end today. But of course our main job today is to carry on looking at the work of Van Gogh. No, that's mine. Were you not here last week? You didn't get this one?
No, this one's on how
It's passing around. Whoever has the pile of Gogh ones, can you bring it back and leave it here so people come late will be able to pick one up? When the handouts reach the end, can someone bring that back and put them here for people who arrive late? So looking at the work of Van Gogh, I gave a very sort of simple breakdown of his career into three phases, three places that he lived while he was an artist. Basically living in Holland while also he was in Belgium for a while, living in the north of Europe, if you like. That was his first phase, when he's mostly working in a tonal way, thinking in terms of light and dark, influenced by realist styles of painting, trying to do a little bit more maybe than the realist style would allow him to do, pushing at the edges of it. Then he moves to Paris, where he has an encounter with Impressionism, but also with the Japanese print and with the art of Seurat. Lots of new influences coming into play, and his style is in transformation. But perhaps at that stage his style hasn't really settled. You know, it's not yet his signature style that we know him for. And then the final phase, which is what we're going to look at today, is his time in the south of France. He primarily, to begin with, he was living in the city of Arles. And it's during that phase when he puts all those influences together and develops his signature idiom. And most of the works that he's most famous for are created during a very short period in the south of France. First living in Arles, then living in Saint-Rémy. At the very end of his life, he goes back up to near Paris, a place called Gogh. Where he's living is quite important for Van Gogh. Maybe some artists, some people are not that concerned, not that touched by where they happen to be living. Probably all of us at some level are, but some more than others maybe. Van Gogh is partly because he's an artist who works out of doors, as the Impressionists did before him, but not all artists did. If you work in a studio, maybe one studio is more similar to another studio, but if you work out of doors, you're maybe more sensitive to the difference of climate, the difference of the difference of the environment. Anyway, Van Gogh, for whatever reason, was very sensitive to place, and more than that, I would say his works reflect that. I can even say I see in his work a sort of conscious binary between north and south. You know, maybe that was already there when we saw the still life with the Bible and the French novel. He's talking about the different locations that he could choose to live, staying in the north, going to the south. Actually, in modern art, there's a large story of artists from Northern Europe coming down to the Mediterranean and to a climate that for them is quite different. And here's another phenomenon. If you're from a place, maybe you don't notice what is so special about it in a way. You're so used to it, that's what you grew up with. Maybe it's the people from outside who kind of are particularly aware of the characteristics of that place. So the part of the story of Mediterranean art, southern art, is the story of northerners coming there. You know, it's the same with the fauve artists in the early 20th century who often worked in the south of France. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them were artists from the north. There's the reality of a place. You go to a place and you're struck by it, and there may be many things you were never even expecting but are actually quite important. But there's also your preconceptions, your fantasies about a place. Actually, the whole of human life is affected by this, not just our fantasies about place, but our fantasies about people, what we think a person is going to be like, our fantasies about someone that we fall in love with or something like that. Everything in human life, they could be our image and they could be the reality. Maybe there's never a moment when you escape fantasy to reality. Maybe you're always having images of the world and inhabiting them, but it's something to think about. There's an idea of what you would be expecting if you were going to the south of France. There'd be an idea of what the Mediterranean is. To some extent, it's a shared idea. To some extent, it would be Van Gogh's personal idea. Someone who's very good at talking about this whole issue is the French writer Proust, has this very long, multi-volume novel, In Search of Lost Time. Actually, it sort of starts off with the young narrator fantasizing about going to visit the French coast and what it would be like there, and he sees pictures of the place in a book, and then when he gets there, it's not exactly, well, not at all what he imagined. So this is there's a syndrome, say, with Japanese tourists going to Paris. There's a certain Japanese idea of what Paris would be like and French culture would be like. And some tourists go almost a bit crazy when they get there because they're either their expectations are so high. A similar thing happens with Jerusalem, of religious tourists going to Jerusalem. Some have sort of religious mental breakdowns because they finally get to the place that they have thought of as the heart of their religion and so forth. So I'm trying to talk about the importance of place, something to bear in mind when we look at Van Gogh's work in a part of the world that was new to him. What I'm showing you here is not a work made at Arles, but a work made at Saint-Mary-sur-Mer, which is a little seaside resort. He actually moved south to Arles in February of 1888, but in June of 1888 he spent about a week at this little seaside resort. It's not one of these luxurious south of France holiday locations, where rich people live and have their life, like Nice or Cannes or Juan-les-Pins or something like that. Even today, it's a fairly sort of simple kind of place where a lot of locals will go to enjoy the seaside rather than foreign tourists so much, I think. Various influences still at work. For example, I think he's still looking at the work of Monet. Remember, Monet was one of the key impressionists whose work he came in contact with in his Paris phase. But he goes on learning from these artists, and he goes on learning from the work they're doing in the present tense. We think of the Impressionists as one generation, the Post-Impressionists as another. It's easy to think of art as sort of neat generations like that. But of course, the Impressionists are still going on. Monet lives till 1926. He's still making work after Cubism, after abstract art are there. So this is actually a fairly contemporary work by Monet, 1885 work. So he's responding to work by Monet that you could say is already itself post-impressionist in a way. It's a work where there's a lot of mood, of feeling, expressivity involved. The style is not the same as Van Gogh, but the subject matter is a little bit similar. Boats drawn up on a beach, fishing boats drawn up on a beach. It's very stormy weather, of course. We know Van Gogh has seen this work. He saw it in the gallery where his brother Theo works in Paris, as his brother works in an art dealer's business, and he writes about it to his brother in a letter. So learning from the Impressionists. Apart from Impressionism, I think he's also learning still from the Japanese print. We saw how important that was in his Paris phase. The flat colour, flat areas of paint, that's a property we've seen in the Japanese print. There isn't that much modelling, for instance, if you're thinking of the boat, to give you a sense of its three-dimensional form. You're more aware of these as flat shapes on the surface. The use of bright colour. Of course, the boats themselves could be painted bright colours. No doubt they were. So that gives you, here reality gives you an excuse to use bright colours in your painting. You can't change the colour of the sky, but you could change the colour of a boat and get away with it. See how some of the colours are complementary, orange and blue side by side. So very strong colour interactions that Van Gogh likes. So he's thinking in terms of colour. Part of this has come from the Japanese print. Overall, the composition is a little bit asymmetrical. Again, that's something could be coming from the Japanese print. He's interested in these lines and forms as lines. You're aware of a two-dimensional pattern as much as a sense of three-dimensional space. You're aware of the painting as a painting, not just of a beach with boats on it, as if we're looking through a window. When he talking about this, going back to this theme of how one has preconceptions of a place, one of the things that Van Gogh said about the south of France, he thought it was like Japan. Well, that's actually a funny thing to say, perhaps. Also, of course, we're talking about his preconceptions of Japan, not just his preconceptions of the south of France. He hasn't been to Japan. So Japan is in his thoughts about that place, not just about that artistic influence that he's already encountered. Here's a painting by Mauve. I mentioned Mauve last week as one of the Hague School artists that Van Gogh was interested in, learnt from. I didn't actually at that time show you an example of his work, but here is one from 1876. I'm putting it in here now just partly to help measure how far Van Gogh has moved on from that more tonal conception of painting to this brightly coloristic notion of what he's doing. He himself was using this kind of palette of thinking in terms of lights and darks, so a lot of brown and so forth. He himself also painted the beach at Scheveningen, when he was there. So here the focus is very much on the human activity, the human world, whereas in Van Gogh's case, human presence is pretty much gone, and that's concerned with the social world is not in the foreground anymore. But anyway, it gives us a little chance to measure how he's moved from painting the Atlantic Sea, very stormy, windy kind of coastline there in Holland, to painting the much warmer Mediterranean climate, particularly striking for someone coming from somewhere different. The Harvest. So again, we're in 1888. So he's exploring the landscape of the south of France. He's an artist who always wants to do many things. He wants to describe the details of that specific landscape. He's still concerned with the external world and making a record of it, but that's not enough for him. He wants to do something more. He wants to start with to express a mood. And the mood here is a really rather positive one, maybe quite a sort of calm mood, reflective of his actual mood, in fact, in the early period in the south of France. I'll read you a little bit from one of his letters. He's talking about this particular painting, or this motif, if you like. What I want you to get is a sense of Van Gogh as a very cultured artist, very aware of art history. He's responding very much to the landscape, but he's also very aware of how other artists in the past have represented the landscape, classical artists or more recent artists. So he's almost like trying on different tinted lenses through which he could look at this landscape and trying to say, well, which would be the one that would help me most to capture it. I'm working on a new subject, fields green and yellow as far as the eye can reach. I've already drawn it twice, and I'm starting it again as a painting. Well, a little bit of information there about a working process. It's not an unusual one, a very common one, standard one, if you like, to do drawings first and then to produce a painting. Not every artist works that way. We don't have many drawings by Frans Hals, for instance, but it's a normal approach. It is just like a Salomon Koning. It's referring to this Dutch 17th century artist. You know, the pupil of Rembrandt who painted vast plains. Yeah, it is. You know, Koning, I'll just take one of his works at random, had this sort of very sort of expansive, panoramic sense of the landscape. And yeah, I think there's a bit of that in what Van Gogh has done here. Or it is like Michel or like Jules Dupré, two not very well-known names now, but at the time they were sort of contemporary landscape painters, French landscape painters. But anyway, it is very different from rose gardens. It is true that I have only been through one part of Provence, and that in the other part there is the kind of scenery that you get in Claude Monet, for example. So he's thinking about different parts of Provence, the part of southern France he's living in terms of different artists. I think that's kind of interesting to note that he's thinking it in that way, his art historical sense, mixing Dutch influences, native influences with the modern French influences. Well, a kind of flatness to the painting again. We get a sense of, I mean, like if you take that figure in the field, it's almost like the figure is on the side of the hayrick or straw rick. You know, you get a funny kind of flattening out of space if you think about it that way. Of course, we know we don't need a perfect perspectival construction in order to read space in the painting. That's one of the things that modernists like Van Gogh have learned. Just a few cues is enough to tell you about space, but you can I also want to tell you that a painting is a flat surface. It's a two-dimensional thing, and I need to acknowledge that I'm making a painting. I'm not just trying to mimic a real three-dimensional world. And in fact, how can I in two dimensions? So you're very aware of the composition as a painting. Colour is heightened. There isn't that much modelling, quite flat areas of colour, but there's also very prominent brushwork. This sort of hatched brushwork, which is very prominent in its own right. It just, here it describes the stalks of the corn or whatever it would be, but you also read it as individual strokes of the brush. You're aware of the actual means of painting become part of the subject of the work. You're aware of it at the forms and the colours are what you first see, perhaps. There's a sort of horizontal layering. There's quite a concern with boundaries. He likes strong outlines. We saw that even in his earliest drawings. But he also likes boundaries as a subject, like fences, edges of fields. He's often picking that kind of thing up. Whereas if you look at a Monet painting, Monet wants to blur boundaries often. Not the distinctions you know are there, but let's see what you can actually see. Maybe it's a misty day, maybe snow has covered the ground and obscured those boundaries, maybe flooding has done that. Let's emphasize connection or wholeness, if you like. But Van Gogh, in reaction against that, wanting to emphasize distinction, creating individual distinct forms more. There's not much going on really in the foreground. In a traditional landscape painting, usually there's some activity, some narrative element even in the foreground, some framing motifs. Quite daringly, there are no such things here. But the Impressionists before him had often emptied the foreground. Monet often emptied the foreground in his landscapes of any significant events. Nothing to especially detain the eye. Colour is the first and foremost thing we probably would notice when we see this painting. He's already reached his moment of mature style. So why is he using bright colour? Let's see what he himself has to say. He says, nature in the south can't be painted with the palette of the north. Oh, so he's saying, I'm using colours that are not naturalistically true. They're heightened beyond what you'd see in nature, but I'm doing it to give you a better sense of reality. I'm not arbitrarily trying to escape from reality and make paintings completely different from reality. Actually, I'm still concerned with reality, but this is a better way of doing it. A palette nowadays is absolutely colourful, he says. So here's part of it. It's still a reality-orientated art, even though the style breaks from realism. I think that's kind of important to note. That's part of his motivation. Like if you were doing a black and white drawing, let's say it's even not a modernistic work of art, it's a work in a traditional, or let's say a realist manner, very detailed black and white drawing. Nevertheless, you would use the whole range from the bare white of the paper to the darkest dark that you could produce with your pencil or charcoal, whatever it is. Normally you'd use that whole range. Even if the scene in front of you didn't have any pure whites or any pure darks, you would use the whole range in order to better express the scene in front of you. Well, so why can't Van Gogh use the whole range of colours instead of just feeling, I can only use a sort of toned down, watered down yellow because I can only see a watered down yellow. No, you can use the whole range, just like a pianist might use the whole range of the keyboard. Why not? You start from the range of possibilities you have. With music, the question wouldn't even come up of, well, are those very low sounds something I can hear in reality? It's not that sort of question at all. Here's another thing he says. By strengthening all colours, one again obtains calm and harmony. Well, here he's now talking about using bright colours to express something. It's not just about representation, depiction, it's about expression of mood. Well, there's a question of whether he's succeeded or not, but he's saying he's trying to convey a mood of calm or harmony through heightened colours. He's using complementary colours, of course. There's a lot of yellow in the painting, but also a kind of blue. Blue and orange are complementaries, and we see that at different spots. Some of the yellow is kind of orangey, but Van Gogh also sort of treats yellow and blue, not just orange and blue, as if they were complementaries. That seems to fit a little bit with some of the thinking at that time. Maybe the notion of complementary colours is a sort of 19th century notion in many ways. It develops a lot in the 19th century. In a sense, it's a slightly arbitrary way of thinking about colour. So calm. So here we have a work by Van Gogh where he's reached his mature style, but it's all very calm and largely harmonious, So this, I think, is a bit of evidence against one of the most cliched ideas about Van Gogh. Van Gogh, he paints in a funny way because he was crazy or something like that. That somehow the style of Van Gogh is a kind of expression of a madness. Okay, he does have troubles with mental illness a little bit later in his life, pretty soon, in fact, but it's not here. He hasn't had a mental breakdown at this point, yet he does have his mature style. So I think we have to look at other things to understand his evolution as an artist, and not jump to some rather extreme biographical reading. That would be to denigrate what he's achieved, really. Another influence I haven't mentioned so far, which is really important in a way, is the artist Delacroix. Delacroix is probably the greatest French sort of colorist of the Romantic period. I guess you all know his work. He also used complementary colors sometimes. I think Van Gogh was influenced by that. There's also a book by a color theorist called Charles Blanc, who wrote a lot about Blanc. He wrote a lot about Delacroix, so that also raised Delacroix's status, if you like, for artists thinking about color. I should say there's another scene that Van Gogh does of this, another representation of the same scene but a different season. So he comes back to it but shows it in a springtime mood. He likes to think in terms of the different seasons, so that's all part of it. So exaggeration of color, exaggeration is something. This is something we're going to meet a lot in modern art, and it's sometimes a little bit difficult for some people to take. They say, well, it's sort of arbitrary, or it's not true to reality. But that's there in all the arts. Like an actor whispering on stage. If that actor actually whispered, you wouldn't be able to hear in the back row what the actor is saying. So an actor would represent a whisper in a quite loud voice, so you can actually hear it. Everything is artivist in a way in the world of art. Well, again, a very famous image, the bedroom at Arles, 1888 again. This is such a important year, breakthrough year for Van Gogh, and I would say for post-impressionism as a whole. It's really a breakthrough year for Gogh, we'll see. And Cézanne around that time is having a big flowering of his own art, although maybe it's a little bit less broken down to one particular year. Let me again sort of read you a little bit of what he says. He's writing letters to his brother, who's in another place. He couldn't put his new work up on Instagram or something like that. He has to write letters, luckily for us, describing. Sometimes there's a little sketch. And he's writing to someone who's a sophisticated interpreter of art. As I said before, I don't expect you to be able to sort of follow it all. I just want you to get a little bit of the flavor of how he talks about it. I had a new idea in my head, and here is the sketch to it. He does a little sketch. This time it's simply my bedroom, only here colour is to do everything, and giving by its simplification a grander style to things. Grander style to things is to be suggestive here of rest. So there's a lot of information there. He's talking about the colour is the central means for his painting. Colour is to do everything. And giving by its simplification. Well, yeah, simplifying. An impressionist painting, they want to tell you about every little nuance of light that in the scene. Van Gogh is finding, well, that's not necessary. I can give you a much more simplified, summary sense of things, and I can maybe intensify my painting as a result. In a word, to look at the picture ought to rest the brain, or rather the imagination. So he's not concerned just about description, he's concerned about how a painting could transform the mood, could express a mood or transform the mood of the viewer. I'll give you his detailed description because his brother needs to know what the colours are. He has to write it all down. The walls are pale violet. The ground is of red tiles. The wood of the bed and chairs is the yellow of fresh butter. The sheets and pillows very light greenish lemon. The toilet table orange, the basin blue, the doors lilac. Actually, if you're paying close attention, you might say, actually, that's not right, because the colours that we see before us are not exactly as he describes them. And here is an interesting problem. The colours have actually changed in the painting themselves. They've deteriorated. That happens more with some colours than others. I mean, in the 19th century actually was a time when there was a development of new paints, new chemical paints, rather than the invented new colours. So there are new colours in 19th century art you wouldn't see before, but that weren't there in the Renaissance or something. But some of those new products turn out not to have lasting power. They may have deteriorated over time. They're not tried and tested. So this is a big problem for a conservator. If you're the conservator in the Van Gogh Museum, what do? Do you leave it as it is, knowing that that's not the colours that were originally there? Or do you try to restore it? How do you know? Are you prepared to paint over Van Gogh's painting to restore the colours? It will be your brushstrokes, not Van Gogh's then. And are you absolutely sure what those colours were like? There are some ways you can try and tell from contemporary black and white photos or something that give you some information of how the colour has changed. It's a real problem. But I think from our point of view, we should at least be aware that we're not always looking exactly at what Van Gogh painted, and that's the same maybe true of other artists. Generally speaking, as art historians, we're really lucky that we have those things we're studying that have survived from another time right to now, whereas military historians don't have those battles here and now, etc., etc. Other kinds of historians have similar problems. We're pretty lucky that we can almost do time travel. Well, it's the art that has time traveled into our present. But we need to be aware it's not quite as easy as that. All right, back to what he says. He talks about the frame. He says, the frame, as there is no white in the picture, will be white. So the frame is actually kind of an important thing. The same is true for Seurat. Seurat is also very concerned with the frame. He will paint the frame. The frame becomes part of the work. I shall work at it again all day, but you will see how simple the conception is. The shading and the cast shadows are suppressed. It is painted in the flat, free washes like the Japanese print. So he's consciously acknowledging that he's learning from Japanese art. There's nothing with a Japanese flavour here. He's not interested in that superficial Japanesery, women in kimonos and all that stuff, which maybe helps sell painting sometimes. He's not interested in that, but he's learnt and now digested the lessons of Japanese art. So Impressionism is so concerned with nuance of light. Academic painting is concerned with modelling three-dimensional form through light and shadow. Van Gogh is breaking with both of those things. So under the bed, no shadow at all. Just flattening forms. A painting is an arrangement of two-dimensional forms. Free flat washes, he calls it. So colour centrality, the purity of colours, the flat areas of forms, the Japanese print influence. It's all very, actually it's very good that we have these letters from Van Gogh to his brother especially, that tell us about his art and his struggles as an artist. But there's actually quite a funny piece by the American comedian and filmmaker Woody Allen. The title of it is "If the Impressionists Had Been Dentists," and he sort of rewrites the letters of Van Gogh as if it's the struggles of a dentist rather than the struggles of an artist. And that's kind of interesting in a way to think, do we allow dentists more any less space than artists for their talking about their struggle? Do we romanticize art too much? That's partly what Woody Allen is trying to say. The sort of distorted buckle perspective of the floor, he hasn't got rid of perspective, but he's broken it a bit. So it all feels a bit wrong. Actually, something similar to that could be seen in some of the prints in the English illustrated magazines by English artists that Van Gogh liked, and he collected the back issues of those magazines. So that's another influence still at work here. This is something I saw in Shanghai. It's going back to making the point I made at the very beginning of looking at Van Gogh last week, how he's so well known and everyone loves him all over the world, and he's sort of been appropriated into popular culture and movies and everything. So in a mall in Shanghai, just adjacent to the Xintiandi area, there's a sort of reconstruction of this painting as a three-dimensional space. I suppose the idea is you could take your photo with it or something like that. But anyway, it just shows how wherever you are in the world, Van Gogh is a reference you can play with. You know, it's already been appropriated, and we have to sort of work to peel away all these sort of layers of accretion somehow to get back to Van Gogh himself and what he was really trying to do. Sunflowers were a very famous subject of him. Again, we're still in 1888. Well, again, yellow is the colour that's dominating everything. Yellow, maybe you could say, has this sort of very positive associations. It's a sort of light-filled colour, and there's the intrinsic or culturally added, developed sense of what yellow itself might express. But that's sort of tangled up with the subject itself of sunflowers and what symbolism that might have. It's not like a Baroque artist who has taken a particular well-recognized symbol that everyone can interpret. You know, a woman with a trumpet equals fame or something like that. It's symbolism in some more personal way. You know, the sun, of course, is life-giving, positive energy. It makes things grow. So all the associations are largely positive. Joy in living, creativity. I think all of these are the kind of associations he'd want you to get. But it's not a kind of programmatic symbolism. It's largely sort of unconscious or intuitive. So it's a feature of the landscape there, but not particular. You know, you could have painted sunflowers in the north. It's a flower that the flower head becomes itself a fruit, or you know, the nuts or whatever you want, seeds you want to, maybe you want to call it. That it's a flower that promises some kind of harvest later. It's another specific thing about it. Of course, it's very flat. There's no background space, and that's appropriate to what he was planning. He was thinking of decorating his new home in Arles with a series of panels of flowers. So that sort of decorative function, you know, function can influence the look of an artwork. You need to think about that. just to give you a bit of comparison, here's a Monet painting of sunflowers. Obviously Monet's trying to give you much more detail. Even just the fact that he's choosing sunflowers rather than some other kind of flowers, they're strong, robust, spiky kind of things. It's a different mood from the sort of, oh, pretty little flower type of painting. You know, it's some specific mood is possible because of the nature of the flower. Energetic, spiky, vital. The All-Night Cafe. This is September of 1888. This is the first of the works we're looking at where you could say the mood is something more negative, less upbeat. He's exploring different aspects of the range of human emotion now. Actually, I want to think of him as often thinking in terms of binaries. So binary might be night and day, for instance. Here's a night cafe. The sunflowers is very much a sort of daytime subject, you know, the flower that follows the sun through the sky. It's associated even in its name with the sun, which is what gives you daylight. There's a whole sequence of works where he's representing night scenes. Now, it's not, you know, artists before him have represented night scenes, and he himself, we saw an evening or night scene when we looked at the potato eaters. So it's not even new completely in his own output. But at this time in Arles, he does several night scenes. So he actually stayed up at night to paint this over, I think, 3 nights or so. Slept during the day, worked at night. And it was a place he was familiar with. I think he stayed at this cafe, he boarded at this cafe when he first arrived at Arles, before he found the lodging that, there's a couple of other places that he stayed. One is the place where the bedroom at Arles is shown. And then there's another place called the Yellow House that he also paints from the outside where he stayed. And nighttime, well, cafes were a very important subject for Impressionist painters too. And the, you know, cafe culture was, they would meet in cafes, their life revolved around them. But the night cafe has a different flavor. These are more the kind of outcasts or people at the edge of society, people who don't have a home to go to. It could be quite literally that that's the case, that you're spending your whole night in a cafe because you don't have any other roof over your head. You know, this is just a way to get through the night. And it could be a slightly sort of sordid place. What would go on there? Maybe prostitution or other activities what might take place there. It's not, as it would be in an Impressionist painting, a site of sociability. People are all in their separate little groups. They may be pairs, but basically there's a sense of separation. Alienation, if you like, is the modern experience of individuality. You're an individual, you have freedom, but you're also somehow alone. You know, it's all part of the intrinsic modern experience. Our value system is not fixed and given to us at birth by our religion and society. We have to decide everything for ourselves. You can get a bit lost sometimes, lose your sense of meaning in life. This is all the modern challenge. It's not just vision that's in crisis. Everything is in crisis in the modern world. You know, we have to decide everything for ourselves. You know, what constitutes the way to be a man or a woman. You know, everything, gender roles, everything is kind of up for grabs instead of fixed for you by society. There are positive things about that, but maybe it's also challenging things too. So I'm trying to say this is a painting about night cafes, perhaps, or a particular night cafe, but it's also a painting about modernity, the modern condition. It has broader relevance. Even if we've never been to a night cafe in France, in southern France, we still can learn something from an image like this. It specifies a certain kind of experience for us. So, talking about it in formal terms, heightening colour for expressive effect. We've seen that already, but it's certainly coming through here. And when Van Gogh talks about the use of colour, he does make it clear. He knows what he's doing. He says, I use colour arbitrarily to express myself more vigorously. The expressive dimension of artwork is enhanced by using the whole range of colours, including intense ones. Just as a violinist will use very loud sounds as well as very quiet sounds. You use the whole range of possibilities. This picture, talking specifically about this work, he says, this picture is one of the ugliest I have done. He's not trying to create something beautiful. It's to express a mood, specify a mood. That doesn't have to be pretty looking or anything. It's the equivalent, though different, of the potato eaters. I've tried to express the terrible passions of humanity by means of red and green. He's trying to express a sort of clashing of emotions, if you like, through the clashing of complementary colours, red and green. Well, we see the red walls and the green of the billiard table, particularly. The room is blood red and dark yellow with a green billiard table in the middle. It goes on to describe the colour scheme. Everywhere there is a clash and contrast of the most disparate reds and greens. It's not that he's using these bright colours to create harmony. Maybe you see that happening, say, in the work of Matisse. Bright colours balanced to create a visual harmony. In fact, Van Gogh is an artist who likes there to be clashes. Colours are eating away at each other. There's a sort of rawness in his work. Clashing of opposites. Sometimes people, I think, misinterpret that as saying, well, Van Gogh's colour arrangements, they're very simple. He just puts a bunch of complementaries down together, whereas an artist like Matisse is much more sophisticated. He'll do something more complicated than that. But I don't see it that way. I see him as deliberately wanting a raw kind of clashing, an unresolvedness of opposites in his work. Opposites at the level of colour, opposites at the level of night versus day, or north versus south, life versus death, the ultimate unresolvable binary. His art is very concerned with that kind of thing. It is colour not locally true from the point of view of the delusive realist, but colour suggesting some emotion of an ardent temperament. Talking about this work specifically. Colour to express. I've tried to express the idea that the cafe is a place where one can ruin oneself, go mad and commit a crime. An atmosphere like a devil's furnace of pale sulphur. Of course, colour's, I think, the main thing, but also the distortion of perspective, the flaw, helps create that mood. He's using shadow when he wants to. The billiard table has a shadow, but nothing else has a shadow. Again, this is all the lessons from the Japanese print. Use shadow if you want it, if it works at a formal level. Something about expressivity, one mustn't assume necessarily that the mood of the painting is Van Gogh's mood. That would be another danger of the biographical approach. Take, for example, a singer. Maybe every evening when she performs, she sings a sad song. Does that mean she actually is sad every evening at 10 minutes past 9 when it's time for her to sing that song, she is sad? No, of course not. Her song specifies a sad mood, but it doesn't mean that she's sad, even if she wrote that song herself. And then the next song is a happy song. It doesn't mean she's suddenly happy. Maybe she's got a lot of things to worry about in her life. You don't know. But anyway, that song specifies happiness and so forth. So the expressive mood is the mood of the painting. One mustn't assume that one can tell what the artist who made it is feeling. In the amount of time it takes to make a painting, your mood could go through all sorts of different ranges. This damn painting, I'm never going to finish it, or something. Hooray, I finished it. All sorts of moods could be to do with the making of the painting itself, let alone what you're feeling about life or something. Gogh. I'll say a bit more after our break, which I'm delaying slightly, but saying a little more, because Gauguin comes to live with Van Gogh in Arles, and there's a sort of artistic interaction with it. I'll say a bit more, and I'll say more when we talk about Gauguin himself, look at it from his point of view. But here's a Gauguin painting of that same night cafe, and I suppose it's part of the artistic dialogue between them. He's responding to what Van Gogh did, painting that night cafe scene. So here's Gauguin. There's probably a little touch of competitiveness involved, but there's also more broadly a dialogue. So Gauguin has focused more on the individual personalities that are there in the cafe. You coming closer, especially to the woman in the foreground. Her gaze is out towards you, the viewer, slightly suggestive gaze. What kind of a woman is she? She's talking with you. What kind of a woman would be there on her own in a cafe late at night anyway? That's a question that would come up to the contemporary viewer. And then Van Gogh did a response to Gauguin's response to his painting. He takes that woman and then isolates her. She's no longer in a cafe setting. He gives her some books to be reading, so she's more a kind of learned, elevated, educated woman, not the sort of woman who's that Gauguin's potentially representing here, drinking alcohol late at night in a cafe. Or the views, the views about the role of women in that time were much stricter. So there, a dialogue. I think he's still thinking about Seurat. Remember, this is Seurat's La Parade. This is an example of Seurat's style, which we know already from his Paris phase he was interested in. He made a visit to Seurat's studio just before he left. Maybe in the studio he could see not just the finished works, but the studies made and the works in progress. This is a study, a small-scale study that Seurat made for La Parade to plan out the colours and composition. And if you're an artist visiting an artist studio, you may not just be interested in the finished works. You might be more interested to know about the process of how he arrived at those works. You might be more interested in the study than in the final work. Anyway, the way he represents the lights here and the dashes of brushstroke to represent the light radiating out, I think it has a little bit of similarity to how Van Gogh treats the lamps here in his night cafe, or night cafe. Another possible influence at work then. He is interested in these night scenes. So even before he painted that night cafe, he made this portrait of Gogh, a friend anyway, and gave a nighttime sky background to it. So a starry night sky. So it's part of I'm trying to establish there is a sort of sequence of nighttime works that he's producing. and it's yellow against blue again. And that yellow against blue contrast comes up in a nighttime scene again of a cafe, and it's once more it's a very famous work by Van Gogh. Another night cafe scene in Arles with that same starry night sky. I see this also as a kind of binary work. It's almost like he's thinking of day versus night, but maybe the artificial light of the cafe stands in for a sort of artificial daytime fighting against the blue of the night. The two are working against each other. There's artificial human light, and there's, as it in 19th century terms, God's light of the night, the stars. I think it's a deliberate sort of contrast and a deliberate sense of clash, I think, is what we're meant to get. Or two things warring one against the other. I want to give you just this sense of how, to me, it's a slightly edgy world here. Again, this is a nighttime painting painted at night. That's fairly unusual. It's not easy to paint outdoors at night. It's dark. That makes it difficult to paint properly. But there's so much artificial illumination around. He was able to do it. Yeah, that cafe is still there. Again, I'm going back to my theme about Van Gogh as sort of a person who's been appropriated as a personality, in this case by the Arles tourism industry, and the people who bought up that particular cafe and were sure to repaint it with yellow and have lights installed that recreate the feel of the painting. I don't think this is done by the cafe owner. This is done by the municipality, the town. They narrativize various places in the city where Van Gogh painted. It's good information. It's like if you wander around Shangwan or something, you get this street is the dried seafood street and all this kind of thing. The narrativization of a lived environment for the tourist gaze. So all of this is the complicated reality we have to deal with, trying to recapture. In a way, all this has the tendency of sort of somehow taming Van Gogh, reducing him to a cliche. Okay, let's take our break there. It's slightly delayed, but we started a bit late today as well.